Hello and welcome to the second half of my Chapter 8 lecture. And due to the circumstances, of course, last night and what's going on in the state of Maine, I felt it was probably a good time for us to sit back and reflect and send positive energies for the people that are impacted by this and certainly remaining safe. So I felt it prudent to move the class into this format, give you a lecture on the material, it's just a short lecture, and we can go from there. But I didn't want to just have this situation disrupt the continuity of our class. So I'm going to basically pick up where I left off on the last class, and that I'd introduced the slide at that point when we start talking about sex and gender. Now, the terms that I'm going to be using are the definitions of these terms. I want to go into some time with that just so that we're understanding whenever we're talking about these things, certainly in the scientific and social political situation we are in right now regarding these terms. It's important to lay down what we mean when we're talking about these things. So the terms we're going to be looking at is sex, gender, and sexuality. Now, for the basis of what we're going to be talking about today, sex is consistent with genotype and phenotype. So genotype is the presence of sex markers in our genes, XX chromosomes, XY chromosomes, and a few, very, very few, but particular anomalies that can occur in the genetic code. And phenotype is the way in which those genes have been expressed. Now, not all of our genes necessarily get expressed. Sometimes they get triggered later in life. Sometimes they get triggered because, we've already talked about how some receptors can actually bind and release chemicals into the cell in order to enact and trigger genetic code. So we know that those things happen throughout life. The phenotype is the outward expression of the genotype. So it's not inclusive of everything that's in there, but it's what we would consider, like, say, our body type, our body shapes, and whatnot that reflect our genotype. So that's when we're talking about sex. Gender, for the sake of our conversation, is exclusively the socially constructed norms that we have connected to the genotype, phenotype. So not to get confused with the debates on what is a woman, what is a man, those kinds of issues. We're just looking at the social norms associated with a particular culture related to genotype, phenotype. Now, we understand now, too, and kind of like the way I personally have approached this particular topic is our society and many societies throughout history have had a very, very distinct difference between what we might call male traits and female traits as they're defined by socially constructed norms. Over time, those distinctions have, of course, become more limited. So an individual, per se, has much more capacity to feel comfortable taking from either one of those particular places and being either one of those particular places. That capability and that status of individuals has existed for our entire history, but we're at a point in our current culture where we're addressing that directly in terms of individuals having a predisposition or making choices to select traits that are from either one of those boxes. So and then the socio-cultural component of that is, in reality, one box has been, the male box has been of traits has usually been uplifted, and the female box of traits has been suppressed in some ways. So in terms of what are desirable traits, as psychologists, we know that all the traits are valuable and equal to one another, but society doesn't necessarily reflect those particular values. So, and the final one is sexuality, which is the component of a person's sex and gender traits having to do with attraction, romance. And I'm kind of using the LGBTQ, although that's a term and a phrase and a logo that is used to describe gender as well, but a significant number of those letters actually refer to an individual's sexuality. And that's just where I'm going with that. So that defines the different sexualities that somebody has. Now, over the years of dealing with this, of teaching this topic within my classes, I've looked for various tools to express the current thought in terms of how we're dealing with sex and gender as a field. And here, in talking about this from a biological standpoint, what role does biology play? Right at the beginning of the class, if you remember, I might have said that biopsych tends to try and explain all of human experience with the biological perspective. We understand that will never quite be complete, but the attempt is there. So there's certainly biological aspects of our human experience that contribute to this. But the model that we now have for trying to understand the diversity that exists within this among different people arose primarily, the best model I've come across is a model called the genderbread person. And it's a graphic that was developed to attempt to depict all the components of diversity that exist within this realm. And so what we have this figure, and if you look at the figure on the left, the gingerbread person, we have areas of anatomy here where particular aspects of that individual self are represented. So in the mind, we have gender identity. In the heart, we have gender-related attraction. We have sex being represented by the genitals. And then the line going around the individual here is the expression of that particular person's gender, how they dress, how they choose to hold themselves, whether they use makeup or not, or any one of those things that expresses the individual's gender on to the outside world. And then over on the right, we have continuums. So rather than a strict binary either or component on each one of these, what you're looking at, and in this particular version, this is version 3.3, what they've done, let's say we look at the first characteristic here, we have gender identity, and what we have is there's a line that defines womanness from 0 to max. Then we have manness from 0 to max. And an individual can have a degree of either one of those. They can have some degree of womanness, some degree of manness in terms of their own gender identity. Then we look at the next one, we see the same sort of pairing of gender expression, the outward telling of the world of who you are. We see that continuum of no feminine to maximum feminine, no masculine to maximum masculinity. Then we have biological sex. This reflects intersex qualities of 0 to femaleness, 0 to maleness again, and then we get down into sexuality. And in this particular model, they separate out sexual attraction and romantic attraction. So this model really gives us an interesting way to tear apart or to unpack the notion of a person's individual sexual identity, having to do with gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, who they're attracted to, and who they're romantically attracted to. All 5 of these characteristics building up the individual in terms of their own identity and expression. We are still trying to figure out the degree to which this is biologically based. There are incredibly strong evidence that a person's sexuality, who they're attracted to, has deep biological components. Of course, the physiological components of their body are biologically dictated, but equally, pathways in the brain are impacted by the sex hormones that are going on. As we talked in the earlier part of the class, sex hormones have an organizing component in the developing human being in terms of creating the individual along whatever is a component of their sex, let's say, is being created throughout the body. Hormones are not precise instruments. Those hormones are released and they affect all parts of the body. And so these are areas that, from a scientific point of view, we're still grappling with those. We're still trying to understand what gets kind of pre-programmed early in life and what is there early on, and how do these hormones affect a person later on. Certain questions, certainly about modifying the presence of hormones in individuals, particularly young people, because we don't really understand what the total effects of those. So those are careful pathways to go when you're looking at considering hormone treatment when someone is really young. And the same sort of discussions that come up in society about trans men and trans women in terms of their participation in sports, participation in places, the whole revolution that went on in the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts. Now they're all called Scouts. And those kinds of questions are social structures which have been really based around a very strict binary perspective on this are being challenged. And the science is still catching up. This is relatively, we're using all of the new aspects of being able to explore the brain and to explore our biology and genetics to help us understand this perspective and understanding the diversity of gender, sex, and sexuality. So that said, in the history of psychology, when we embed it into the cultures in which it was birthed, we see that the actual study of what is an incredibly important part of the human experience, sexual behavior, didn't occur right off. Those were areas that were considered off limits for the study within psychology. And so it wasn't until a little bit later, the early 1900s, that we see the first studies coming out on sexual behavior. And principally the first ones was, of course, the Kinsey study from the work of Alfred Kinsey. And he interviewed individuals and created a scale regarding a person's sexual experiences. And based on their histories, when he would meet with people, he would ask them about their sexual histories and what they've experienced and what they've done. And he would place people on this scale, addressing at this early time the continuity that would exist between a person whose experiences have been completely heterosexual to those that have been exclusively homosexual. And that rating scale, you can see on this screen here, brings us to 0 is exclusively heterosexual, 1 predominantly heterosexual, only incidentally homosexual, predominantly heterosexual but more than incidentally homosexual. Then there's equal heterosexual, homosexual, what we might call bisexual now. Predominantly homosexual but more than incidentally heterosexual. Predominantly homosexual, only incidentally heterosexual. Exclusively homosexual, and no sexual contact or reactions. Now this early phrasing of this idea was the first. It's obviously not complete. We see from the graphic of the genderbread person that this is not the totality of the human experience in sexuality, but it was the beginning of an understanding that there's this variety. And truthfully, at this day, it really it sent a very somewhat controversial message that this was actually going on. In fact, one of the phrases that one of the outcomes of this particular study was that American men, about 10% of American men, had experienced a sexual encounter with a person of the same sex and achieved orgasm at least once in their life. So 10% had experienced that. That got misinterpreted as a figure that would represent what is the population of homosexual individuals, in this case, gay men. It's not quite accurate because that 10% was a different question, but it certainly arose in the popular literature. The term of 10% of the nation being homosexual has been used to make the argument that statistically this was considered normal. That argument is, of course, that argument occurred, and the result of that, even though the data was not just specific to that, was one of the results of that was the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders removed homosexuality from its diagnostic criteria. There's other sexual disorders that cause dysfunction and whatnot, and some of those are being looked at right now in terms of defining the question, let's say in gender dysphoria, an individual who has anxiety based on a mismatch between their internal perceptions of their gender and their bodies and the external presentation of their gender. That term we're looking at that term to determine whether or not, to determine that there are variations of that particular existence that are not dysfunctional. There are, of course, variations that are. The individual is in trouble, the individual is suicidal, the individual is under distress. And then there are individuals who that mismatch is not necessarily a disorder for them. So from the clinical perspective, we're really kind of looking at this. Is it a problem for the individual? And then from a socio-political standpoint, is the problem in the individual and their sense of coming to reality and dealing with that difference? Or is it political, where that individual's existence is undergoing resistance from society? And we're certainly seeing that happen right now in our political world as laws are being created that are targeting individuals whose existence is described this way. So we start to see the science mixed up in society's changing norms and values, and then the socio-political actions that are going on and the power bases and whatnot. And for some people, this is quite distressing. The very sense of who they are, they feel like it's under attack. It is under attack. And the science is still trying to figure out where do we locate those issues so that we can intervene and help people live and happily and thrive, being the persons that they are. Okay, so the last place we're going to go in terms of our topics here is the concept of attraction. Attraction is complex. It's deeply centered in our evolutionary history, but it's incredibly complex, and it's quite removed from the ways in which animals are attracted to each other. We have much more impact of social norms and social expectations. And so one of the key questions that we might ask is, what are people looking for in terms of their what would they like in their ideal partner? And this chart recognizes a number of different traits that have been found to be important for both men and women. And the chart shows men as the dark line for each term here. Let's say we looked at altruism. The dark line represents the degree to which men prefer that particular characteristic, and you see the white line representing how women perceive that. And as you go through each one of these, you kind of see that there's certainly differences between what men and women are looking for in those particular areas. If you look straight across these, we see that they're pretty close, except for one, and that is the degree of masculinity. We see quite a difference between men do not necessarily very much want to perceive masculinity in their partners, but women do. Women have a higher degree of that. But you see other characteristics much higher. We see so dominance is kind of low, but faithfulness, look, that's way up there. Then we have charisma, intelligence. These are all characteristics that people look for, regardless of their men or women, looking for these characteristics. This particular study didn't necessarily tease out same-sex couples, what they look for. I would present that from what I've read, that it's pretty similar in terms of what those individuals are looking for as well. Now, another question that comes up is, and it's sort of when we look at the term assortative mating, is to what degree do we, how do we pick the individual that we look? What are the characteristics of an individual that draw us to them? And a basic question that's out there is, we have two phrases in our society. One is birds of a feather flock together, and the other one is opposites attract. And these are used to describe the characteristics of individuals in romantic relationship, or friends as well, in any sort of intimate relationship. But what is it? Do birds of a feather flock together? Do people who are similar end up with much more stable relationships, or do people exist in complementary relationships where the characteristics of each other are different? Now, study after study has actually given us a pretty cohesive answer on this, and the fact is, nope. Opposites do not attract. Birds of a feather flock together. Individuals may have significant differences. They may have significant skill differences. One might be good at finances. One is good at, maintaining the house. One is better with the kids. One is not. Those kinds of things. But when it comes down to really important values, important characteristics and traits, similarities draw that knowledge has driven the actual online dating world. The tests that have been created to make on personality tests have actually been created, and they simply match individuals who are like them. We are attracted to people who are like us. Kind of sounds like a little egocentric for that, but we're attracted to that. And those characteristics include things like height, IQ, attractiveness itself, the degree of attractiveness. We have youthful individuals are kind of the base level attraction, and brain chemistry. Like, I'm including this one because I found an online test that characterizes personality using terms from brain chemistry and the effect of these chemicals on our brains. So dopamine, serotonin, testosterone, and estrogen. It characterizes 4 types of individuals, and it uses this to match individuals on their personality. That particular test is available on this QR code, but it's also in the chapter notes. Now, the validity of this particular test and using those chemicals, it's essentially taking, if you were all serotonin, all dopamine, all testosterone, all estrogen. What are the principal characteristics that we might see from that, based on our understanding of those chemicals. This is not a test of the actual presence of those chemicals. This is a test that is non-standardized and whatnot. But it is one of the most common, the actual questions used in this test are the ones that are used most prominently in the online dating world. So people are making important decisions based on it. So this is the lecture for today. Sorry that we couldn't be together for this, but certainly circumstances are that way. And I hope you are being safe. Hope you're being well. And look forward to seeing you folks on Tuesday. So have a great week. I'll talk to you later.